Okay, hello and welcome to the tour of Couchiching Beach Park, Orillia, Ontario. You're just getting a view of the Aqua Theatre and the waterfront. Essentially, this is a 21-acre park that covers much, if not all, of Orillia's main public waterfront. For the purposes of this change agency research proposal, I'm looking at systems of waste at the park. The building you're looking at right now is a concession stand that's open during the summer. And I don't know if you could see, oh, there's my fingers, apologies. I don't know if you could see, but there were some black bins outside of the concession stand. Those are garbage bins, which we'll see throughout the park. And you'll notice that while there are an abundance of garbage and recycling bins in the area, there are in fact no options to deal with compostable waste separately from trash and recyclable materials. So this was something that I considered to be a bit of an issue, simply because this park gets quite a bit of traffic, particularly over the summer months, and it has a concession stand, a separate small restaurant, and 2 food trucks, which create a fair bit of food waste on a regular basis. Beyond that, there's a number of special events that are held here throughout the summer, from events celebrating a Scottish festival to Canada Day festivities and movies in the park. And essentially there's a fair bit of compostable waste that is generated at this location. And so for the purposes of this tour, I'm going to walk you through the park, take a look at some of the systems that are currently in place and some of the questions that I had looking at sustainability moving forward. So this big sort of construction site, if you can see it on the right there, we'll just look at the cyclist there, that is actually a statue that's currently being torn down at the park. And it was a statue of Samuel de Champlain that was pretty problematic. It included some indigenous figures painted in, not a particularly good light. And I wanted to just give a nod to this because when we're talking about sustainability, we also want to consider the social aspects of waste and of systems. And right across the lake here, there's actually an indigenous reserve. And so one of the considerations that I wanted to really think about when doing this project is, how does the waste that we're producing at this park affect indigenous people and affect the land that we're on that really doesn't belong to us? So definitely something to keep in mind moving forward, particularly when establishing an effective system for managing compostable waste is such an easy way to deal with waste that then can really benefit the land and can benefit the soil and reduce the need for chemicals moving forward. So up till now in this tour, we've been walking along a trail. This is actually a Trans-Canada trail that also runs through the park. It gets quite a bit of traffic. We've seen a couple cyclists. I think there's someone sitting on the bench there, and pedestrians walking along. And you'll notice that it runs right parallel to the water. So this was another consideration that I really wanted to keep in mind when looking at the waste systems here, simply because, proximity to water means waste management becomes that much more important. We know that water absorbs a ridiculous amount of waste. I think pretty much everyone now has heard of the little island of plastic floating in the middle of an ocean. So having effective waste systems at a park that is really features the waterfront is sort of becomes even more necessary when you're advertising, come visit our waterfront, but you're not necessarily taking care of it because you're not managing the waste. Right here we have a little pavilion where people gather to eat, picnic. It's also very close to the waterfront, and I don't know if you could see, but there actually aren't any waste bins in that area. So this was another issue that I saw when touring this park, is that there really aren't that many garbage and recycling bins. Not even looking at compost, the waste management system does seem to be lacking. I don't know if it's just because the snow has recently melted, but there was a fair bit of waste sort of strewn about. I don't know how much of that is captured in the tour, but keep an eye out for it. And I wonder if that could perhaps be remedied by making the walking distance between bins and waste receptacles a little bit smaller, simply because I know people don't like to really go out of their way to discard their garbage. So making that more convenient for park goers might be something that could be very beneficial. So moving forward, we're just crossing the boardwalk and we're going to be coming up to a playground. It's actually sitting on my right now as we're walking down. I didn't want to turn the camera to it because I didn't want to record the kids. But that's something that I also wanted to just note, just the presence of children at this park and really looking at instilling these values of composting waste, recycling waste, really taking the time and making the effort to minimize the waste that you are putting into the system is something that I think is so important. And by not having effective compost systems at this park, I wonder if we're subtly giving children using it the message that it's not really that important. Moving up here, this is a good view of a recycling bin and a garbage bin. There's 1, 2, 3 sets here near picnic tables. So we walked probably about half a kilometer without seeing any waste receptacles, and now we have 3 in a little cluster. On one hand, this is maybe a good thing because it's located right near the parking lot. That little yellow building across the road is French's food stand. So perhaps it is a really good idea to have this little cluster of garbage bins. But I'm wondering if spreading these out a little bit more through the park might be beneficial. I also wanted to just zoom in on the label here. This was something that I thought was really positive, that the city is actually going out of their way to say, this is what can be recycled. So really there's no excuse. If you have a plastic water bottle or a coffee cup, you know where that belongs. And I think this is something that's extremely beneficial. And I was lucky enough to talk to a representative from the city of Orillia, from the Parks and Recreation Department, who said that she had actually noticed in the past 4 or 5 years that cross-contamination between garbage and recycling had been significantly reduced. So that is to say that people were becoming more aware of what belongs in the recycling bin and what belongs in the garbage bin. And this is something that's super important because if there is cross-contamination, a lot of times that means that an entire unit of what otherwise could have been recycled goods is no longer able to be recycled because it's been contaminated with garbage. So just moving through the parking lot here, we zoomed in on French's food stand, which we discussed a little bit earlier, but walking through the parking lot, this was something that I really thought was interesting as well, talking about systems of waste and sustainability or lack thereof. This was a beautiful day, and you can see the parking lot isn't quite as full as maybe it would be in the middle of summer, but there's still a fair number of cars. And each one of those cars, created its own emissions, created its own greenhouse gas on its way here. A couple of them, I don't know if you can tell, but a couple of them are running with their air conditioning on, with people sitting, eating their lunch. And this maybe doesn't seem like a super terrible thing, and in a lot of ways, it's great to have people out to the park. But looking back at the footprint of theaters and how so much waste generated from the theater industry and the arts industry isn't actually from those buildings, but from cars, you're kind of forced to wonder, how much waste is this park generating through people driving to and from the park? To film this tour, I took my car and I drove to the park. How much waste did that generate? So that's something, I guess, that speaks to this idea that I think has been a bit of a recurring theme for me in this course, that sustainability really needs to be part of the infrastructure. This is sort of stepping outside of the park a little bit, but public transportation in the city of Orillia is really, really severely lacking. So because of that, a lot of these people didn't have another option. It's either take your car or walk, and while it's not a super big city, it's big enough that, unless you are traveling on one of the limited bus routes, you're kind of obligated to take your car. So that's something that perhaps isn't necessarily within the park system, but certainly affects the park and the waste generated here. So at this point, we're moving into a little bit more green space in the park. Lovely to see. And I did just want to take a minute to discuss, as we're walking along here, some new initiatives that have been put in place at the park. I mentioned very briefly earlier this idea of waste diversion, and I've attached some photos at the end of my paper, but we're coming up right now to these bins. The city of Aurelia has recently implemented a waste diversion policy, and this was done with the help of the Environmental Advisory Committee. And essentially what it states is that if you are doing a special event at the park, you must have your garbage bins in this style. So it's very, very clear what is garbage, what is recycling. And you'll see the ones that they mandate for special events actually have very detailed labels regarding which types of waste belong in which bin. And this was interesting because when I was speaking to Ms. Ward about this waste diversion policy, she really spoke to how special events were really the focus. There was a lot of emphasis on making sure that waste was dealt with for special events, but not so much for the rest of the year, which is interesting because it's not as though the park doesn't have recycling and garbage bins, but it seems that sustainability is considered something for special times, not for every day. It's considered something that's nice to have and a good addition, but not necessarily something that needs to be part of the park's infrastructure.